net, and for that, of course, we have to thank the Cardinal. If you had to rely on me, none of that would ever happen. What I'm about capable of doing is asking someone else to photocopy. That's my whole technical range right there. In addition, we have had a wonderful array of soups during the course of this series, and I would like to thank those who provided that hospitality to us. Glad you joined me in that. I do want to have the mulligatawny again. Very good. As has just been discovered by the person who introduced me, the topic of this final lecture is Christophany, the historical resurrection. And the reason for my focus on that topic is I want to pose the question, what is it that makes the resurrection coherently historical? To what extent can we speak of it as fact, and to what extent are we limited in that assertion, and why? In order to do that, as you can see in the little summary that I posted by way of an invitation to this meeting, I have had to dismiss two very common approaches. And I dismiss them both, although they seem to be opposite, for exactly the same reason. Both of these approaches, although they claim to be diametrically opposed, in fact fall into the same fallacy. Namely, the fallacy of thinking that because you might say something about one particular resurrection story, that must apply to all the resurrection stories. And so I'll give you two examples from recent literature. One comes from a scholar named Gerd Ludemann, who has argued that there is only one experience at the source of the resurrection. It is Peter's guilt. Because Peter felt guilty about his own role in not defending Jesus, by way of psychological compensation, he had a hallucination in which he thought that Jesus had forgiven him. That accounts for the stories about Peter. And then once Peter said that to others, they joined in the same experience. Now, the difficulty, of course, is that Peter didn't even have contact with all of the people by whom Jesus was seen. We have observed throughout this series, that is from last autumn, that there are a range of resurrection appearances. And to try to reduce them all to Peter's experience alone, even if Ludemann is right about that experience, which is questionable, would not be a way forward historically. But then similarly, another range of opinion, led recently by N.T. Wright, has argued that every single story about the resurrection is based upon the idea of the tomb of Jesus being empty. But we have already seen that the story of the empty tomb evolved over time. And the tomb did not become empty in the sense of someone walking in and looking until the time of the Gospel according to St. Luke, by which time there had been a whole range of experiences already, many of which had nothing to do with Jerusalem, much less an empty tomb. So when we want to think historically, we need to be able to take account of a full range of evidence, not just the evidence which happens to accord with our own particular theory. That's why you have the schema from Paul with associated sources laid out from halfway down page 1. And you'll observe there that I'm simply naming the people that Paul names in that famous list, the earliest list there is, of those by whom Jesus was seen. And I've put beside those names the passages which we have already discussed. And I list them here simply as a convenience so that you could easily go back. I have to say, too, that in this little summary presentation, I have also included more passages from the Gospel according to Peter, which is not in the New Testament than I referred to. And I have also included reference to the Gospel according to Philip, also not in the New Testament. But that was simply for reasons of time and also so as to avoid killing too many trees in giving you texts during the course of the series. I have not added any text that tells us anything substantially different from what we've been able to perceive in the passages I'm referring to. So we indeed begin with Kepha, with Peter, and his experience of forgiveness from Jesus, and together with that experience of being forgiven himself, the commission that he receives to see to it that others are forgiven. This is not simply a personal reassurance to Peter, as some people have described it. It is a programmatic activity that he is involved with. That activity is so programmatic that when we move down to the second entry, the 12, there's a widening of what they do, namely there are more people who join in the forgiveness, but at the same time also it's understood that God's Spirit is given in the resurrection so that forgiveness in Jesus' name can be extended outward. In the case of Kepha, the issue is forgiveness itself. In the case of the 12, it is the giving of Spirit which permits the circle of forgiveness to widen. We then come to Paul's reference to more than 500 brothers at once and their decision on the basis of their experience in order to baptize others into the name of Jesus so that those people might be able to receive God's Spirit at the same time. You'll observe how the entire radius of Spirit is steadily widening through these cycles of tradition. Next, Paul continues on his list by naming that other person who stood side by side with Peter when Paul met with Peter in Jerusalem in the year 35, namely James, the brother of Jesus. And we saw when we looked at the Gospel according to the Hebrews that James' experience of the resurrection is quite distinctive as compared to the others, because it is specifically linked to breaking his fast at the time of the Eucharist, on the understanding that he is told, "Arise, break bread, because the Son of Man is risen from among those who sleep." In other words, Eucharist, or the Mass, is presented as something which is actually hosted by the risen Jesus. This is a distinct understanding from what we've had from the other circles of tradition. Paul, in his list, then mentions all of the apostles, and among them we saw very prominently Silas, who, as you can see in the summary, is behind that story at the very beginning of the book of Acts, according to which, despite the range that we're exposed to by all of the resurrection stories, only in Jerusalem did the resurrection truly occur. And according to Silas, that limitation goes hand in hand with the idea that only those who had been part of Jesus' movement from the beginning knew him to have raised from the dead, and that they had a direct and palpable experience of Jesus. There is no doubt whatsoever, but there is a very strong stream in the New Testament associated with the idea that the resurrection was physical. It's attributable to Silas. And by making it physical, Silas is also making the resurrection highly local. Only Jerusalem authorities, then, can be authoritative teachers of this resurrection, a memo which somehow never reached the Apostle Paul. So, in fact, if we move on, we're now over at the top of page 2. We also have a story associated with Barnabas, namely the famous account of what happened to two disciples who were traveling outside of Jerusalem, despite what Silas might say, towards a village called Emmaus, where Jesus appears to them as a stranger who explains to them the messianic sense of Scripture. Namely, he says, "Have you not read in the Scriptures how it was necessary for the Messiah to suffer, to die, and then to arise in glory?" Only when they are joined together with the same stranger in the inn in order to eat do they recognize this person as Jesus, and then he disappears. A way of understanding resurrection which is really quite unlike the tradition associated with Silas. Within this overall category that Paul has of all the apostles, I would also include Mary Magdalene and her encounter first with a young man, later with Jesus himself, that causes Mary to tell the other apostles that they are to go to Galilee in order to account the risen Jesus. Mary is very tightly linked with the idea that the resurrection occurs in Galilee, has to be there, in fact, is not Jerusalem. And then we have Paul himself, who describes himself as being somewhere near to Damascus. Where exactly, he doesn't say, when, as he describes it, Jesus was revealed within him. In addition, as you see, I've included the other passages that we've read together in the course of the series, but I would say that they develop further from the ideas of Paul that we've already seen. So that indeed is to some extent a summary of what we've seen that permits you to go back, if you need to look at the materials already provided. But now, looking beneath the black line at page 2, I am introducing the issue of there being differing spectra, differing variations along a comparable line that show us the range we need to account for if we're thinking about the resurrection historically. The first is a question of geographical spectra. By that I mean that there's more than one. It is not only the most obvious, namely, some of these things are set up in Jerusalem and only Jerusalem, while others are equally insistent that it's Galilee and only Galilee. So we have that geographical spectrum. And it's one, you notice, that sometimes is represented within one and the same gospel. So it's quite clear that the evangelists were able to live with this diversity better than some of my colleagues in the discipline of New Testament studies who want to say, I can explain it all with Jerusalem. You can't. Or I want to explain it all with Galilee. You can't. The stories are quite categorical. And in addition to that geographical spectrum, there's another, that which says, is it territorial Israel? All right, include Jerusalem and Galilee, but then we're still moving outside, because Damascus is in neither. Ephesus is in neither. Edessa is in neither. Instead, we have to talk about a spectrum that runs from territorial Israel, the historical land of promise, to what was usually known as the diaspora. That vast extent of most of the world outside of Israel is also a place where the resurrection is reported as experienced and where the resurrection is also promised. In texts such as the Apocalypse, the Revelation to John, and also in the Gospel according to Thomas, which is based primarily in Edessa. Side by side with these geographical spectra, we also have a spectrum of the alleged time in which this is to occur. Again, according to Silas, this is exactly 40 days. According to Silas in the book of Acts, he's with his original disciples 40 days, and that puts a limit on the amount of time in which the resurrection might occur. But the fact is that beyond that 40 days, we have many of the stories that we've dealt with, including in the list of Paul himself. And it's thoroughly impossible to include within those 40 days, the materials that we've got, say, in the Gospel according to Thomas or the Apocalypse. Then we also have to deal with a wide spectrum of witnesses, namely, who are the people by whom Jesus is seen? Is it, for example, a single witness? Sometimes we have that in association with Peter, and we have it in the case of Paul. But in addition to that, we have passages in which we have select groups. Now, that might be the 12, but in some cases we are actually dealing with subgroups of the 12. And on occasion, it's a select group, but they're not actually among the 12 at all. For example, the story of the two disciples on the way to Emmaus. They are disciples. They're not apostles. They're not part of the group of the 12. So when I say select groups, there's also variation within that. Then the more than 500 that Paul refers to, and beyond that, the total number of people who would read, say, I've said here the Apocalypse, but the same would apply to the Gospel according to Thomas, and themselves have an experience of what is being referred to, namely the Christophany of the Son of Man at the beginning of the Apocalypse, or in the case of the Gospel according to Thomas, the understanding that the risen Jesus is embedded in each of us as the image of God. There is, in principle, no limitation to that growing awareness, so the spectrum of witnesses in that sense becomes infinite on that side. And the last spectrum I'd like to refer to is the spectrum of evidence. That is, what do the people who announce themselves as witnesses of the resurrection say they experience to bring about that conviction? Here, too, we see variation. Sometimes, as I've said, especially in the tradition of Silas, the evidence is direct and physical. Jesus eats. He wants his cooked fish in the Gospel according to Luke. Sometimes we have the story of the tomb being empty. But do bear in mind that that is, relatively speaking, a later development as compared to the cooked fish story. Sometimes the evidence for Jesus being raised from the dead is purely visual. And that is why the most typical verb used to describe what happens in the resurrection is that Jesus was seen by, and then the witness is named. So when Paul gives that list in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, he is basically using as the default position the idea that we can speak of vision as being the usual way in which Jesus is experienced as being alive. That doesn't exclude other possibilities, but it does represent itself as being the typical way in which Jesus is known. But there are stories, chiefly in the book of Acts, where an appearance is understood as being not visual, but auditory. Namely, Jesus speaking to a person, and that person acting as a result. And then finally, this is true of Paul himself when he writes to the Galatians, and it's true of the Gospel according to Thomas. There are texts in which the resurrection is portrayed as a purely interior event for the person concerned. So for Paul, this is when it pleased God to reveal his Son in me. So you understand why I have difficulty following my colleagues in discovering some kind of coherence by picking one point along these spectra and saying that's the very one that generates all the others. I don't believe that's possible. I think the range of experience is too wide for us to measure it in that way. However, I think that there is another way of discovering this coherence, and that is by looking at the issue of what the imperatives of the resurrection are. And that's the last section that I give you on page 2. What I mean by imperatives of the resurrection is this, that the typical pattern of stories actually includes an element which has persistently been overlooked in the past. Resurrection is what? It's the awareness that Jesus is absent, then his presence, then the recognition of Jesus being present. This is something which is in common with all the stories, right across the board. But there's another element as well, a fourth element. Namely, the resurrection includes a specific imperative. You are to start doing that thing that you have not been doing. And it is a teaching that was not obvious from Jesus during the time that he was alive in the usual sense. So, in the case of Mary Magdalene, she is going to a place to mourn. That would be her conventional purpose in going towards the tomb. And her experience before she actually arrives at the end of her work is to be turned around and directed to go to Galilee and to tell Peter and the others that they are to do the same thing. In other words, there is a strong displacement, as I say, in the impetus of the resurrection as experienced by Mary Magdalene and her associates. Forgiveness, we've already seen, is the actual content of the resurrection story as told by Peter or Kepha. And this forgiveness is not for Jesus' forgiveness of Peter alone. That's the way Gerd Ludemann takes it, and it's not what the text says. It's rather that his forgiveness causes an act of forgiveness of others. In the case of the 12, this program of forgiving others is predicated upon the gift of spirit, which means more people are doing it in a more coordinated fashion. And here I want to introduce an observation. These imperatives of Jesus are clearly related to activities he himself engaged in when he was alive, but they are all intensified. Prior to his death, Jesus never says to Peter and the others, go out there and forgive people. He himself engages in forgiveness. He teaches about the importance of asking for forgiveness. But as a programmatic activity, we only see it as a result of the resurrection. Similarly, the idea that God's Spirit is not especially available only to a few individuals, but can inhabit an entire class of people, is one that we see in the resurrection, not prior to the resurrection. And that leads to the observation about the more than 500 people, and also Paul's personal understanding, according to which, in principle, everyone who is immersed in water in Jesus' name receives God's Spirit. Jesus never said that when he was alive. Never sent people out to baptize on that basis. That is a command that uniquely develops during the period of the resurrection. Likewise, although it's quite true that Jesus frequently ate with his disciples when he was alive and got himself a reputation, as he himself said, as a glutton and a drunkard, there is really no moment within the story of Jesus that corresponds to Jesus' appearance as Son of Man to James, telling him, "Arise, eat bread," because the very act of eating bread in Eucharist now celebrates the resurrection. That is a new development, as is the development that we see from Silas, the idea that you have to await an actual judgment by Jesus when he returns in order to discipline your current activity. This is the real theology that's behind Silas' interesting view of the resurrection. Namely, you have to be tied to Jerusalem because it is from Jerusalem that the judgment of the world is going to take place. And part of the imperative, therefore, of resurrection is to await that with steadfastness. And lastly, the Barnaban tradition insists upon the idea that we can read the scriptures of Israel in such a way that we understand the whole pattern of messianic experience within it. Now, these differing imperatives, as I say, are clearly related to some of the teachings of Jesus during his lifetime, and I would point out that they can especially be connected to the key points within the Lord's Prayer that he taught his disciples. But what happens in the resurrection is all of these activities are intensified. They start acting in this way. They had not acted this way prior to the resurrection. They had not acted this way in the fellowship of Jesus. Jesus himself had not actually done it. There is no extension of the Spirit to the Gentiles authorized by Jesus when he was alive. It only occurs in the resurrection. So dealing with this question of what the coherence of the resurrection is historically, I think the appropriate response is that we can see a pattern of behavior that had not existed beforehand, that does persist in the period after the resurrection, and that these imperatives, although all rooted in various teachings of Jesus, only come to their full intensity in the resurrection. Can we then speak of the resurrection as being an historical fact? Seems to me that we can, in terms of its impact on how people behaved. In other words, as an influence in history, the resurrection is historical. But then you have to ask the question, in addition to that influence in history, can we also say that Jesus was raised from the dead? And it seems to me that these stories tell us that those people who say so joined in one or other of these activities. You know, the centuries-long acclamation at the celebration of Easter is Ho Christos aneste, ho kurios alethos aneste. Christ is risen, and the response is, the Lord is risen. We say, indeed. But the Greek doesn't say indeed. Greeks are not so Anglican. The Greek says, the Lord is truly risen, alethos. So what is the truth of the resurrection? The truth of the resurrection is the performance of these activities as being commissioned by the risen Christ. If that's what we mean when we say those words, then he is risen on that day, and any day those words are said. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, please, Tess.
When Christ appears to Mary Magdalene and to the others, it's very clear that it's not the body that they knew. So is it theologically accepted that the actual physical body of Christ just vanished?
The question is a very good one. Is it theologically accepted that the physical body of Jesus just vanished? And let me pause for a moment on this idea of body for a moment as distinct from what we call physical. And for this purpose, I want to turn to St. Paul's development of exactly this theme, also in 1 Corinthians 15. Once Paul gives us his famous list, which really, I think, must be the bedrock of analysis, he then develops an understanding of what this must mean for the resurrection of Christ and also the resurrection of everyone. He believes that they are one and the same phenomenon in principle. And as he makes that analysis, Paul makes a strong distinction between what we would call physical and what we would call body. He believes that what we call physical is sarx, his term for flesh. And he believes that flesh always disappears. You know, you may like to think that it's going to go on and on. You may sometimes behave that way if you're less than 20 years old, but in fact, you know very well that flesh is passing. Yet Paul, when he looks at a person, also believes that people are not just flesh. People are also what he calls psyche. They're also soul. And by that, he means each of us has an awareness which permits us to animate our bodies. But Paul thinks that goes too. Paul thinks that soul is the same thing as breath, Hebrew nephesh. So when you die, you lose your flesh and the soul too. The only element, as Paul sees it, that actually continues and which has an eternal existence is spirit. Because spirit, which he says is distinct from flesh, distinct from soul, spirit is the one element about us which is symmetrical with God. God himself is spirit. Insofar as we are spirit, we go on forever with God. So then, what's the resurrection? Paul's answer is, the resurrection is of what he calls a soma pneumatikon, a spiritual body. What he means by spiritual body is that its entire environment is spiritual, so it's not physical. If you said to Paul, do you mean that physically Christ disappeared? I think St. Paul would say, well, yeah. On the other hand, he's also saying, when I was sent by someone who was clearly fully possessed of human agency. An agency so crisp and clear that it has to be associated with a spiritual body. So there is a configuration of the person that is not the same as a way a person is built in the flesh. There's such a thing as a configuration in the spirit that Paul refers to as being the spiritual body. Now, having said that, obviously, here's another spectrum. Silas is at the other end of the spectrum, and he would say, vanished? Are you crazy? What really happens is that Jesus appeared to his disciples in the same body that he died with. But then you say, but how do you mean that he was resuscitated? The answer comes back, no, because this Jesus whom we meet, although continuous with who he was, is also eternal. Do you then mean that his flesh is eternal? Yes. But that means it's a very different kind of flesh than what we are accustomed to. So St. Augustine, who is a great fan of Silas' point of view, and who argues against the Pauline point of view, nonetheless has to say, flesh that becomes spiritual is no longer flesh. An interesting statement. In other words, there is always a strong discontinuity in being alive forever and being alive as a mortal. In a similar way, the church father Origen, who is very much for Paul and very much against the Silas point of view, Origen argues that, in fact, the most perfect existence imaginable is not with bodies, but rather with geometrical form. Whereupon the question has to be answered by Origen, writing in the 3rd century, well, are you then saying that the human body in the resurrection is no longer configured as a body? And he says, no, I don't mean that. Not for human beings. So Origen actually conceives of God as a sphere. But he does not conceive of human beings in that way. So both those who argue for something like a continuation of the present body and those who argue for something like a complete replacement of the present body, whether you're on the Silas or the Paul side of the spectrum, find themselves having to adjust, owing to the difficulty we have of placing this kind of experience within the terms of reference of this world. I mean, the claim is implicit in the resurrection. We are not talking about the way reality is structured right now when we speak of the risen Jesus. We are talking about a different reality, which is also demanding a different conduct out of people, a conduct which has not been asked of them before. And therefore, our capacity to describe what that is limited. Augustine himself says, words cannot achieve a description. And then he goes on for 3 chapters to try to accomplish precisely that aim. The fact that it's difficult and that we always have to acknowledge that whatever model is used is going to be subject to severe correction should not prevent us from attempting to be as cogent as we can. And while we're doing that, it does seem to me that by looking at the nature of the imperatives that flow from the resurrection, we can understand the degree to which it is historically coherent, although that doesn't mean that we can pin down which of these views is primal. I suspect none of them is primal. That is, I suspect that they are intrinsically various representations of much the same experience. But because it is an experience outside the norm of what we perceive, there's going to be a significant amount of variety. Yes, please.
Yes. You said that Jesus never said to forgive outside of his own, area. So I'm curious when the injunction, and I'm not sure by whom, was given to go and preach to all nations.
Yep, that appears in the Gospel according to Matthew. I just broke the cardinal rule. I'm sorry, I did not repeat the question. Really is the cardinal rule. The question was, at what stage does Jesus tell his followers to go and preach to all nations? He makes that command precisely at the very end of the Gospel according to Matthew, after he's risen from the dead. This is exactly my point. And it's not my point alone, I have to admit to a complete lack of originality in this regard, because in the Gospel according to Matthew, when Jesus first gathers the 12, sends them out, he tells them in so many words, do not go in any way of the Gentiles. Do not go to the Gentiles, but only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Right? Jesus' entire focus at that stage is clearly on Israel, as we might expect, because his Greek was lousy. Basically, the only language he truly commanded was Aramaic, and the horizon of his interest was Galilee and Jerusalem. We don't see him actually focused on anything else. Such contact as he has with non-Jews is entirely incidental, and it's quite clear that sometimes he doesn't like it. You know, when the Gentile woman approaches him in the Gospel according to Mark for healing of her daughter, he says, you don't take the bread of the children and throw it to the dogs. You know, this is not a kind response. It is a xenophobic response. And Jesus, in this case, represents a perfectly conventional attitude towards the Gentiles. And Matthew is very well aware of this, but Matthew also understands everything's been changed by the resurrection. And now, in the resurrection, he tells his followers, go make disciples of all nations, teaching them to keep the things that I have told you. Now, the teaching is to be universal. And in addition to universal, those in the nations are to become disciples. If they are disciples, they are not only people you talk to, they're ultimately going to be people that you listen to. It authorizes Gentile teachers of the instruction of Jesus. No one expects that prior to the resurrection, least of all the disciples, which is why it takes them so much time and trouble to actually put that into effect. The opening scene of a later gospel, the Gospel according to Mary, pictures the disciples meeting together after they have been given this instruction by the risen Jesus. And their response is to say, oh no. Look what happened to Jesus himself when he had any kind of concourse with Gentiles. Look at what the Romans did to him. Do we really have to do the same thing? And the reason that Mary then goes to them and tells her tells them her experience of the risen Jesus is that she says, yeah, you actually have to do that because that's what he said. And she literally tells them in the Greek of the gospel according to Mary that they should man up. They should see to it that they engage in this difficult injunction. But it is fascinating that the resurrection is the watershed of this, and Matthew is well aware of the fact. There's a question just behind Abby. Yeah.
If I understand correctly, you see this spectrum of experiences of views of the resurrection. In today's world, the differences between those different views makes all the difference in the world as to who's included or excluded from church membership. There are millions of us who can understand a spiritual resurrection more easily than we can a more limited. Where is the Anglican Episcopal Church in terms of that view relative to every Sunday hearing the creeds, which seem to describe a very conservative?
Mm-hmm. Excellent question. And the question was, is there room in the Anglican Church for the kind of thing I've been talking about? And let me just explain a few ways in which there is, I would say, plenty of room. From the more radical end to the more conservative end. On the more radical end, I've been invited to speak next month at a church in New Jersey, which is an endowed lectureship in honor of Bishop Spong. Bishop Spong has been here for a long time. He and I have been in very close correspondence over the years. In some ways, he regards me as a conservative because I want to deal with the full range of the evidence. Jack thinks he knows which is the most important evidence. He and I will have a wonderful time in New Jersey next month. On the other hand, another person who's recently been active in New York City, a bishop of Australia, has written a book on the resurrection, published by Oxford University Press, kind of reputable, in which he argues that the way in which Paul describes the resurrection as fully interior is the most ancient and historical. Now again, I actually don't quite agree with that. That is, I think that although it is true that Paul's experience as he expresses it himself is fully interior, I don't believe you can explain all the other traditions by saying that they project this outward. So among those of us who have been working on this topic, who happen to be ordained within the Anglican Communion, we have understood this full range. Do we permit it inside our churches? If we're smart, we do. That is, if someone's view of the resurrection among congregations I have served, both here and in England, has an interior view of the resurrection that strikes me as being entirely defensible. Likewise, if they insist that, okay, Luke may be late, but the empty tomb is right, I can't dispute that. I can't prove that it's wrong. And I would also say that the creeds also are actually patient of exactly the diversity that there is in the New Testament. The creeds are often read as being much more restrictive documents than they actually are. The Apostles' Creed has no theory whatever, for example, of the birth of Jesus. Doesn't say a word about the absence of a father, just leaves it. And likewise, when it comes to the resurrection, the Creed says, on the third day he arose from the dead. There is no reference in the Creed to any of these different traditions, which obviously the people who made the Creed knew about at the time. if they had felt like saying at the time, unless you believe the empty tomb, you can't accept the resurrection, they could have said it. Tom Wright would have preferred it, I guess. But he didn't get his way. He lived 20 centuries too late. So the creed, in fact, sets up a structure of faith which operates within a range of opinion that you can see clearly represented in the New Testament and also beyond the New Testament. Now, we live in a time when one of the famous fundamentals of fundamentalism is to assert that Jesus rose from the dead in the same body in which he was executed. Now, that is quite clear that they only agree with Silas. They don't agree with anyone else. Or they try to read everything else in terms of Silas. But the very phrase, resurrection in the same body, which some people have now attributed to the New Testament, was invented at Princeton Theological Seminary by a scholar named Benjamin Warfield. Couldn't make that up. Benjamin Warfield founded what was called the Princeton theology. Later, this was called fundamentalism. I do like to tell my friends at Princeton about this on any possible occasion. And the principle of Warfield was to write against Charles Darwin. Warfield saw, we have trouble because Darwin is talking about actual laws of evolution. The only way that we can respond to this is to establish certain laws of faith. Warfield knew, because although he was wrong, he was educated, Warfield knew there was a variety of opinion in the New Testament. He just really hated it. And so he decided what I'm going to do is to find certain statements which I will say, these are the primal statements, everything else derives from that. So his idea of resurrection in the same body became one of the fundamentals of fundamentalism. But in the case of that fundamental, as in the case of all fundamentals of fundamentalism, it's vital to understand these things are not stated in the New Testament. The claim is these are the axioms you have to receive in order to understand the New Testament at all. The New Testament never says, hello, I am the verbally inspired Word of God. Just never occurs. So it's important to know what is there and what is not there. And in this case, sometimes there's a kind of guilt, I think not too strong a word, by people who think, a statement may be symbolic, or my belief in the resurrection does not involve a resuscitated corpse. I'm not saying that you should not believe one way or another in regard to the options open, but no one should feel guilt about what's already there within the New Testament itself. As I said earlier, surely we can be as diverse as Christians were in the first century. They were under a lot more pressure than we are. Yes, please, Cantor Bob.
Before the cardinal shuts us down, I'm wondering back in the day, in Jesus' day, thinking about the book of Daniel and beliefs among the various groups in Israel.
Excellent, very good.
And also among all, was there a tradition of resurrection or thoughts about resurrection? So that's more, I probably could write a whole book on it, which I'd love to read, but that question. And the other thing is, when people today say, I'm reborn, are they also alluding to somehow in contact with Jesus that he resurrects them?
Right. Very good. Both excellent questions. The first question had to do with what's the background belief? That is, at the time of Jesus, what do people think of as being possible as concerns life after death? The one book of the Hebrew Bible which refers to resurrection is the book of Daniel in chapter 12. And there it is quite plain that Daniel anticipates a resurrection of both the just and the unjust, but his imagery is very interesting because he says that the just will arise like the stars in the heaven. And this from the 2nd century book of Daniel, this appears to line up with the same imagery in the earlier work. It's not in the Hebrew Bible, but it was widely read in the ancient world, namely the book of Enoch. And in the book of Enoch, resurrection is understood as being a shift into angelic existence. You may remember that when Jesus himself was asked about the resurrection, he said that in the resurrection they neither marry nor are they given in marriage, but they are like the angels. So it appears to be the case that Jesus himself shared a view with the book of Daniel and the book of Enoch. But there are several alternatives. Another one is the view among the Pharisees, certainly the most palpable of all views of resurrection, according to which it is held that some of the Pharisees did experiments on this, because they thought if there is to be a resurrection of the dead, they thought it would be physical, like Silas. So they said there must be something in the human body which is indestructible, in that, some people have been eaten by sharks, some people have been burned, some people have been smashed up. So there must be something in the human body that no force on earth could destroy. What is that? And they came to their own satisfaction to prove it was the coccyx. And if you took the coccyx at the base of the spine and you hit it with a hammer or you put it through, and they said they did this, that it would never be destroyed. Therefore, God is going to raise people up from that bone. And their understanding is, at the last day, the reason for all the earthquakes that are going to take place, according to the book of Zechariah, at the last day there'll be this mighty earthquake, and the dead will come underground to Jerusalem, where they will be raised up. I think Paul was reading some Daniel. I think Silas was listening to some Pharisees. Because these are the most prominent schools of thought regarding resurrection. There are others, for example, the Essene point of view, represented by the people of the Qumran scrolls, appear to try for a kind of hybrid between these two points of view. But those are the clearest lines of demarcation. So you have spectra in Jewish belief at the time, just as you do within the New Testament representations. Perhaps that's not a surprise. Neither is it a surprise that the cardinal is gesturing to me in a variety of ways. To avoid him going for the nuclear option, I think I should close now. Thank you very much indeed.